right. Hi, everyone. I'm Teresa. I'm one of the staff members at Chevalier's Books. And welcome to Chevalier's Books Online. We are LA's oldest independent bookstore, established in 1940. So this is our 80th year in business. Tonight's event is something the Chevalier staff has been looking forward to for a very long time. I'm actually very embarrassed to admit that I'm probably the only Chevalier staff member who has not read Octavia Butler, although I am told every day that I should. I have, however, started reading this gorgeous book, Linnell George's A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, which is what we are here to celebrate. It is a book about the literal and literary giant that was Octavia Butler, about her life, but also about her creative process, which makes it, in my opinion, very unique. Charged with interrogating Linnell tonight about this book is Judith Lewis. Judith has been reporting on the environment, politics, social justice since 2003. That amazing reporting has earned her 4 first place awards from the Southern California Journalism Association. She is a contributing editor at Capital Maine and currently writes a column about the nexus between climate and politics, the Heat 2020. And on the receiving end of Judith's journalistic prowess tonight is our main star, Linnell George. This is her 3rd book of nonfiction. As a staff writer for both the LA Times and LA Weekly, Linnell has focused on social issues, visual arts, music, and literature. Her work has been published far and wide, from the Chicago Tribune to the Washington Post to Essence to Miss Magazine. And this is my favorite thing. Fun fact, her liner notes for the Otis Redding Live at the Whiskey A Go-Go earned her a Grammy. Without further ado, I'm going to disappear backstage so we can shine the spotlights on our 2 amazing speakers, the Grammy winner, Lynell George, and Judith Lewis. Please give them a warm digital welcome. Thank you, you two.
Hi, Linnell.
Hello, Judith. How are you?
This is here it is. You're beautiful. I heard about it for so long, and it's like, it's almost, I know surreal is overused, but it's surreal to see it, and it's like beautiful, actual living self.
Wow.
So congratulations. I know
you.
it's a huge deal to finish a book.
Thank you very much.
So, we started talking a little bit before, and I want to continue this conversation more about how Octavia over the years has had these resurgences as her work has suddenly become intensely relevant again. And I think we know we're in one now, obviously. Oh, yeah. And, I remember when I read Parable of the Sower in the 90s, it was one of the first times when I personally confronted climate change. And it wasn't a time, we knew about climate change, and James Hansen had already spoken to Congress in 1988, and Al Gore had written his book in 1992. But it wasn't really part of the national conversation, and people certainly weren't writing fiction about it. Yeah. And I've always been captivated by her prescience. Like when I look back at Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, which are the books that I know best, I've always, thought, wow, like this is what happened in that book, what we're living through. Right. And I like how at one point in the book you said her prescience wasn't clairvoyance. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that she saw in the future. Her prescience was just really careful attention. Mm-hmm. I wonder, and I wonder if you could expound on that a little bit, because she didn't really think of herself as a futurist or she's predicting her. She was a keen, that I think that led to her just knowing what was going to happen. We know what's going to happen.
Right.
In a way.
Yeah. I mean, when you start to look at the archive, particularly well, let me back up a little bit. She called herself a news junkie, and she really,
Yes.
really was. And one of the most fascinating parts of the archive for me, being a journalist, was looking at her collection of newspaper clippings.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And there are thousands of clippings. And, sometimes she would just rip the entire page out, and sometimes it would be clipped very carefully. And you started to look at the subjects. It was divided. The curator who assembled all of this huge archivist that came in, Natalie Russell, she has spoken beautifully about how she got to know Octavia through her papers. And so when I look at Natalie's handwriting, she's filed everything away. So it's, things, climate, vampires, cancer, like all of these things that she would go down rabbit holes. And climate was one of the big things. And yes, as you said, she was aware. She goes, I've been thinking about climate since the late 70s, since the 70s and 80s,
Yeah.
and the other thing that I see in her, in the archive, and this is all the seeds that, we as writers, we collect things. She would go out on walks in her neighborhood and start writing down the changes from month to month and year to year. And so she would notice when a tree wasn't blooming when it used to bloom, or that there were very few pieces of fruit on a bush.
The pomegranates.
The pomegranates. And so there's several notebooks in there that are just geared at that, looking at those sorts of things.
The pomegranates ripening early or not growing as big as she expected them to was something that really struck me, because, our neighbors have a pomegranate tree, and I even noticed that too. And I was like, oh, right. And I loved the parts of your book where she is making lists of the fruits and the things that she sees, and that kind of keen observance, is what, I mean, it's so interesting that she knew about it in the 70s, because that's when the conversation really started to happen. And that seems like when she was really coming into her own as a writer, and gaining some success as a writer too, and maybe really paying attention. In Parable of the Talents also, there's a presidential candidate from Texas who's a science denier, and his slogan is "Help us make America great again."
That's right. And you get a chill when you see this.
I just got a chill when I think about it and talk about it. But I was thinking about it over the weekend, and Ronald Reagan used that phrase less ominously. We didn't think of it as a corrosive phrase back then so much. I mean, it was, but we didn't think of it as, the kind of racist, loaded,
the dog whistle that it is.
The dog whistle, right?
Yeah.
But she probably did.
Absolutely, she did. And
you saw its corrosive nature.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's a good point too, which also connects to this whole, this news junkie thing, because she would sit and she would watch speeches, and she was really attracted, like, people were asking me about, her, characters and that sort of thing, and subjects. And she, like most writers, she didn't go, I'm going to go home and I'm going to create a character who is like Reagan or like this person, because she would look at things like charisma and what made someone charismatic. Who are people we consider to be charismatic, even the ones that we may not be attracted to, in a positive way, maybe in a negative way. What is that? And so she really did start to journal about what was said and what was in the news and what was changing. And, it's in politics too. So that, again, informed her. So these are composites. Yeah. So yes, exactly. So I'm sure she picked that up, and that's became
right. We think of charisma as this positive thing. We think of, Reagan's Morning in America was this positive thing. And we think of, we don't see its dark side so much, but the same thing is true with empathy. With Lauren
Yes.
in Parable of the Sower, she has this condition of hyper empathy, which you think, oh, you know, empathy is this wonderful thing. But this is, to me, what's so relevant right now, that empathy has a very dark side for the individual who's feeling it. And Lauren's hyper empathy requires that she actually kills people to stop their pain from destroying her, right?
Exactly. She has to look away. She has to look away just to distance herself. And she knows what's going to happen, and she's figured out. And then to have two hyper empaths working together is so dangerous, because
really dangerous, right?
They can't take care of one another.
Yeah, and I wonder if that, you know, as a news junkie, she was probably consuming, you know, the wars in Central America in the 80s, and the way, you know, the US was kind of galumphing around the world and so many people were dying. And, you know, we feel that now, like the kids in cage, we've got this phrase now, the kids in cages, you know, with that keeps us from really connecting with what's actually happening. All these, you know, 250,000 people dying from this disease that people are still in denial about. And we have to be like Lauren in some way. We have to mute our empathy in order to survive. And it would be, yeah, you know, it would be interesting to see how she responded to these times when everything she, you know, the string that she was collecting through the 80s and that she brought to bear in her fiction is in relief now. You know, that the pictures and the images that she created, we see that,
right, you
know, we can hardly stand to watch, you know, we were just talking about, you can hardly stand to watch the news, you know. So
she there is something about, you know, I was rereading Parable of the Talents. I've talked about this before, like in the middle of, you know, our wildfires and our heat wave, and the sky was pink and red, and it really was like, this may not be the time to be reading it, or it is the exact time to be reading it, because I couldn't escape any of it. You know, there was no escape. You know, you had to confront it, you know, either on her page or in the world. And there was something about it, it's like, I almost feel, and that was around the time where, after 30 years, Parable of the Sower, you know, rises to the bestseller list in the New York Times. And this is something that she wanted. This is something in her lifetime she did not get to experience. She, you know, part of her affirmations, one of the things was visualizing. And so she would put that out there, and she had a list of what she wanted to do and what she hoped to achieve. And it was to be a #1 bestseller. It did not happen in her lifetime, but it has happened now, both New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. She has made #1, you know.
That's so fascinating.
And it's like, just boggles the mind that, you know, it would be this and it would be now, you know.
Right. And I mean, she almost called the year, because I think Parable of the Talents, she set in 2022.
Parable of the Sower. Yeah.
Parable of the Sower set in 2022. She nailed it,
20s,
you know, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not living in, well, some people are living in walled communities.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So,
yeah. And people are, you know, in tents and walking along the freeways, and, you know, so.
Right. People are walking along the freeways, right. And, you know, protests are blocking the freeways. Shifting gears back to her kind of process of writing, you know, her elementary school teachers, there's one in particular, Isabel Gregg.
Yes.
At Garfield Elementary School, kind of pissed me off. So I remember, you know, she criticized her for her slowness.
Yes.
Right. And her mother wrote this letter saying, well, I'm working on her slownesses, you know, and you see her grappling with that, you know, thinking she's dyslexic, or thinking, you know, I just have to say, like, I so desperately related to that, because I think that, you know, that slowness, those slownesses are part of are part of the creative process in a lot
Oh,
of ways.
absolutely.
And the
Yeah.
rushing is so damaging to creativity.
Yeah.
And like I'm so methodical. I read books so slowly. And it's like, well, I understand completely how her mind was working.
Mhm.
And then she gets to the pony she's riding
Oh
at the
gosh,
carnival.
yeah.
And the pony is going slow, and the children are, the pony has sores from the children hitting it because it's not going fast enough.
Right, right. Yeah,
Do you
yes.
think that was like, you think she saw herself, this was in her horsey period when
Right,
she was really interested in
right.
horses, but
Yes.
that just seemed like a metaphor for her frustration.
It's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way, but her reaction was so strong. You know, the fact
Yeah.
that she never wanted to go there and ride those ponies again when she saw the sores and she saw how the ponies were mistreated. I will
Mm-hmm.
create ponies. I will create my own horses. I will create my own
Yes.
ponies. I will
Right.
make them magic. I will, whatever it was she needed to do. But yeah, I'm sure, again, back to empathy or hyper empathy,
Empathy, hyper empathy,
you
right?
know, you know, I'm sure she felt wounded by that
Right.
too. Yeah. And may have
Right.
seen herself in it. The fact that
Right.
she recalled it with such vividness says something to me.
It does. Yeah. I think it's a combination of both things about her,
Yeah.
you know, the slowness and how little patience the world around you has for that. You know, we have deadlines and we have people looking over our shoulders, and there she was, just really carefully constructing her world,
Yes.
giving the ponies magic so they could transcend those sores,
Yes.
you know.
Yes, exactly.
It's
Exactly.
so it's at once like so full of grace and so heartrending, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
that part of her. Um, and I think, you know, in that slowness, this is like, I'm talking about everything, I think, because I just got so much out of your book that I could relate to and sort of apply to my own writing life. And another part of that, which is, I think, part and parcel of the slowness, is the math of her life.
Yes.
The thing you
Oh
call the
boy, yes.
math of her life.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh gosh. For someone too that she talks about school, for example, and I'm just going to start with that, the idea of being a student who struggled in all of her courses, all of them, all of them. And I looked at her report cards, and that on paper exchange with Isabel Gregg.
Isabel Gregg, yeah.
Isabel Gregg. I had an Isabel in my life too who was not kind. I realized in looking at that, and then looking at the grades, and she talks about here, I wasn't particularly a good student, but I was an avid one. I wanted to know everything, and I wanted to play with it, explore it, think about it, what it might mean, write stories about it. So I say that before we dive into the actual math of her life, she realized, I may not be good at these other things, but so I am going to have to self-construct. I'm going to have to construct something that is going to work for me. And it means I'm going to have to map it on a page. And I'm also going to have to see if it all balances out. And so it started often with time, money, time and money, and time. She had to sit down and look at calendars, days, dates, weeks, months, years, to figure out, okay, here's my plan. And so that's where it starts. It's like, I'm going to go to school, but I also have to work because I have to support myself. This is after she graduates from high school. And she decides really early that she wants to be a writer. And there's not very much support for this. But so in order for her to be a writer, she's she's going, I'm going to go to school. So she's enrolled herself in, she enrolls herself in Pasadena City College. And then she is working full-time and part-time. And she's writing in the morning. She's getting up at 2 in the morning and writing and till the sun comes up, and then, you know, taking a
oh, that landline.
Yeah, it never rings. Okay.
Oh,
Yeah, it never rings. Anyway, she ends up going to, so getting up, getting dressed, getting on a bus, taking a bus across to school, then going to work after that, then coming home, eating her dinner, writing again, going to bed. So math, more like, okay, time spent, and then trying to make all of the ends meet. So some months she doesn't have her rent. Some months she doesn't have money to pay any bills. Sometimes she doesn't have, okay, hold on. I'm just going to. Oh my gosh.
Somebody really wants to get
well, and it's probably not even real.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Anyway, so she's trying really hard to like make ends meet. And she's also trying hard to be true to herself, but fear slips in, because one of these things could just blow up.
Yeah.
And it starts to affect her thinking, her health. You know, she's because she's running everything like on really high, like, you know, at a high level. And I worry, and even in the archive, I start worrying about her, even though I know it works out. Like finally,
right.
But sometimes
it was so precarious.
Yes, it's precarious. There are times that I feel like there's real fear. You know, the real fear is like she's going to like give up. And I, as I've said to people, like, you know, I have the gift of time in the future and living in the future and realizing, no, all this paid off.
Yeah.
But it was such a huge wager for her.
Right.
So it really was. And, you know, she died so young. And I have to think, you know, all of that time spent was, and like the worry and the no sleep and the no doze, and
that's what the ND is, right? Yeah.
You know, all of that.
You can't take it every day, right? The no dose, right?
She would get tired. And so, yeah, so I'm thinking, yeah, the math, the time, the math, yeah.
And yeah, I want to get to the fear. You know, I think we're out, like, all writers have fear. You know, they look at the blank page and their heads bleed, and we have all these stories about fear. And another journalist friend of mine, we were going to get cups printed up that said "Beat the Fear," and I was like, oh, I can relate to that. And then I thought, as I'm reading your book, I'm like, no, my fear is just like being exposed as the idiot I am when I put something down on the page. Her fear was about surviving.
Yeah.
You know,
but it was
she was literally risking her survival to write.
True. But she also was worried about that too. So she had both levels.
Oh, yeah, right.
Her level of, she spent so much time in her journals. And so she had different kinds of journals, and she would journal in different ways. And in her sessioning books in particular, those are the ones where she dealt with the thing that you're talking about, where she felt like, I cannot embarrass myself. She would tell herself, like, if she was going to do any kind of public speaking on a panel or a keynote or anything, she had strict rules for herself. You know, do not open your mouth unless you know exactly the answer. You know what you're going to say. She's very, very difficult on herself because she did not want to be embarrassed, because she already felt like she was people were underestimating her, and she just felt she had to be beyond reproach.
And that followed her all through her success, like after Kindred did really well. And that was pretty young when that, I mean, she was what, 29 or 30, let me see, or 28? But wait,
I
how
don't,
old was, she was pretty young when
she was
Kindred.
young. She was young, but she always, it's like writers today. I mean, you can put a book out, but it's not going
Right,
to make things necessarily easier for you financially. It took her a long
right,
time to, you know, even after she won the MacArthur, you know, she helped her mom out with, you know,
oh,
you know,
right,
her house and all that. And she was always worried about money, not to the extent that she was early, you know, when, you know, we were talking about, you know, do I have to pawn something? Do I have to
right,
pawn
yeah,
my
yeah, what can I
typewriter, my
sell?
bicycle? You know, you know, it wasn't like that,
Right,
but I think there was always a sense of, back to the word precariousness, you know, it's like
right,
she felt precarious. I mean, life felt precarious. Even what she had won felt like it could go away. And she was worried about
right,
writer's block. I mean, that was the other thing. It's like, you know, like, even though she was not someone who believed in, you know, waiting for your muse, like, this is business. I'm going to sit down and, you know, get this done. It's habit. It's butt in chair, you know, time.
yeah,
You know, that's why those calendars are so fascinating to me, that, you know, the objects that I chose told something about, like, the things that she touched daily, and calendars was one of them, because she used them for all kinds of things, you know, to record her days, you know, the days that she would be
mhm,
writing or not writing, or going to school or not going to school. And also, though, it's where she did her page counts. So she could see, okay, I wrote 50 pages today, or I
yeah,
wrote 25 pages today. So she could get to her goal by the end of the week. So yeah, so those things were important to her, in order, because she thought, this is business. This is business.
right. She
This is
wrote contracts with herself. She
profit.
wrote contracts out for herself.
Yes.
I will, I will have $100,000 in cash money by
Yeah, January, whatever, January.
1975. Yeah. And this is how I'm going to do it. Step, step.
Yep.
This is what I need. You know,
Right.
this is what I need at the market. I need this. I love the phony chicken.
The phony chicken.
The phony chicken. You know, she was like all of us, you know, in some ways, like struggling with her fear and shopping for her phony chicken, and just working things out. There's so much humility in the parts of her that come out in your book, you know, and
Yeah.
the other, and the humility, I think, you know, it turned her to this kind of self-improvement regimen, you know, reading all the self-help books she did, like
Right.
Dale Carnegie,
Yeah.
and who was the guy who said, anybody's a genius if you just
Yeah.
work at it long enough, like if you just,
I can't remember if that's Nightingale or the other one, but yes.
I think I wrote it down. Yeah, it might be. Yeah, but I've, you know, I think a lot of fiction writers and creative people, if they're honest with the world, will admit that they read a lot of self-help books. Like, I know people who have really based their creative lives on The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck, you know, and the whole notion of delayed gratification, which is really useful. You know, we laugh at it, but it's really useful. And I imagine, you know, Dale Carnegie and who is it? Who's the other guy Nathaniel Hill? Is that his name?
Napoleon Hill. Yeah.
Napoleon Hill, right.
Her advisors. Her advisors.
Her advisors.
She had to have a team, because she was keeping her dreams and her passions about writing to herself, because she knew that people wouldn't understand what it was that she was trying to do, you know, like in her circles. And so she had to enlist, you know, a team of advisors, the masterminds, as she called them. And the fact that she found these books on the floor in a library, gathering dust, like she so much serendipity in her life, you know, like finding the, you know, Writer magazine in a chair on the bus, or finding these books, and she's like, oh, so I'm going to use these self-help these little aphorisms, but I'm going to write them for a 14-year-old girl, a Black girl. I'm going to turn them around so they speak to me. And that's what got her started on the "So be it, see to it," and all of those affirmations. She wrote her own and she put them up. She would write them on the back of these old calendars and put them around her workspace. And she would there Post-its all over the place to remind her, in her bathroom, and also in the middle of something she was writing, she may start writing some affirmation down because she was stuck. Again, back to the block. So she never. I don't get the sense, even though she was extremely busy. Toward the end of her life, she was traveling all over the world, but the essence of who she was still there, and of that worry, and especially when you have something like, and all of us do, writers, is like, there's that moment, like you sit down to the blank, whatever, page, screen, whatever, however you write, and you wonder, like, okay, can I do this again?
Mm-hmm.
Can I do this well again?
Yeah.
And someone was asking me, like, well, she was always very productive. So was she really blocked? Like, if you're sitting down and you feel like you're writing, I love that term she uses. It's like water over rocks. It just wasn't coming out. She didn't feel like it was flowing. That's a block too. She couldn't access sometimes that flow that she needed. So that would worry her too. So
I wonder if she had lived long enough, because she carried those affirmations with her well into her 50s.
Right.
She still needed to pump herself up, and she still needed to say, so be it, be it, and to keep herself working. And to give herself this was after she was already famous. I mean, she may not have had a bestseller, but she was famous,
absolutely.
She had a large following, but she still needed to do that. And I wonder, if she had lived into her 60s, which I find a very profound decade, because you just, like, things just kind of fall into perspective in a different way. If she would have written a book for writers, like Stephen King did, and because your book functions like that. It's almost like, there were times when I felt like I was at, Linnell and Estelle's writer's workshop. Linnell and Estelle teach you how to write. And then with kind of little drop-ins from Allen Ginsberg. I know that, I don't know that she knew any beat poets, but I know that you and I are both beat poet fans in a lot of ways. And I kept thinking about Allen Ginsberg's saying, observe what's vivid. Observe what's vivid. And vividness is self-selecting, which is what she did.
Right.
That's how she constructed her world.
True. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. And she understood, I want to read this little quote that I saved from Annie Dillard, because it just seems so Octavia Butler to me. She says, examine your schedule. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. What we do with this hour and that one is what we are doing. A schedule defends from chaos and whim. It is a net for catching days. It is scaffolding on which a worker can stand and labor with both hands at sections of time. A schedule is a mock-up of reason and order, willed, faked, and so brought into being. It is a piece and a haven set into the wreck of time. It is a lifeboat on which you find yourself decades later still living. I feel like if I could talk to Octavia now, I would read her that and say, look, you knew this from a very young age, that without a schedule, without like a piece from the wreck of the world, you would not be able to carve out a space to be creative. And it's something I think it takes a lot of writers a long time to learn.
Right. No,
she knew it very young.
She figured it out really early. She was setting up schedules for writing and reading as a teen.
Yeah.
her schedules for writing. But the writing started, as she says, and it's beautiful. She said, I started telling myself stories when I was 4, and I made myself the star of my stories, because she felt she needed to, because she wasn't feeling that anywhere else. And the only reason she started to write them down was because she would tell them out loud to her mother, and she realized that she was forgetting her stories, and like, well, I guess I need to write them down. And so but it was all very early, all very clear. I mean, and that's what's, again, so beautiful about the archive, is that you see her childhood writing, in her childhood hand, in her childhood sketches. She kept everything, a record of, I think, because she knew she needed to, I think it was evidence, for her, like, look at what I've done,
That was
look,
those were her rocks in her edifice that she created. Yeah. I get the sense that her mother, like, even though, she got encouragement from one of her teachers, and, later on got a lot of encouragement from science fiction writers, like Harlan Ellison and, Samuel Delaney too, right? But also at a young age, it seems like her mother was pretty encouraging.
Oh no, her mother, her mother told her, she said, well, maybe you'll be a writer. Now, I think and bought her a typewriter, which was 11, and people around them thought, well, that's very extravagant, to buy a little girl something like that. And
she'll get tired of it.
She'll get tired of it.
Yeah.
It'll gather dust. She'll move on to something else. Her mother knew, but I think as mothers, and especially, and Octavia talked about this a lot, it's like, little Negro girls are not writers, not writers in a professional way. They want, people wanted her out of love. They wanted her, go get a job that has a safety net, or you'll have a pension, or you'll have insurance, or a post office, be a nurse, be a this, because her family had moved from the South, Jim Crow South, to Southern California, to, achieve the dream, and of course got here and found, well, that's not exactly what we entered into. So you need to make sure that you are going to be as safe and as comfortable as you can be. And here you can get a job, and it won't be, but she had other ideas, and she did not want anybody to prick her dream. And
she said she was more willing to do without money than to do without time.
Exactly.
Yeah, because time.
That really hit home.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, because back to the slowfulness, and having, you can't instantly, things don't come in instant. And that's the other thing. She was such a rewriter and redrafter, draft after draft after draft after draft after draft, and you really see, the muscle and the tears and everything, in it, so time.
Are there any writers that you see, fiction writers who have pinged off of her, who have, I don't know of any. I still think of her genres being really sui generis in a lot of ways.
I think so too. And she said, one of these Q&As, and I want to show something. One of the Q&As, she would frequently, the publishers would ask her, questions, and she would write out all these answers to questions. And one of the answers about like science fiction, she goes, I don't really see my work as science fiction. She points to Kindred as an example. And she said, well, that's really more a fantasy. If you think about it, it's time travel, but there's no machine in it. And she said, but I realized, being in a genre like this, or being considered to be a genre writer like this, gave me more room. And that's what she needed in almost every area of her life. And I'm gonna share the screen now because I want to ask you a question. So hang on one second. Let's see if I get this.
I just want to say one thing about Kindred, that I think Kindred leaves open the possibility that all of that happened in her mind.
Yes,
as she was coming to terms with being married to a white man, and
it's not working. Anyway, never mind.
That's all right.
I knew that always happens. Okay. I'll try it one more time.
That it wasn't necessarily like she was actually going back and finding the drowning boy and saving him so he could, but that she could have been dreaming it or thinking it through, and it became real to her. Like that to me is what makes it not science fiction. Like I don't think of that book as science fiction. I did think of Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents more as speculative fiction, which when I read, I was really into at the time, and it fit into that genre. But again, it wasn't like what anybody else was doing at the time. It wasn't William Gibson, it wasn't Samuel Delaney.
No. Well, what I wanted to ask you, because I know we're running out of time, not to jump out of that, but I want to talk about, this is important, and I wanted to ask you about this. One of the beauties of the archive for me too was how she hasn't been gone that long, and so the discoveries of going through someone's papers, who's a working writer, I began to see the community of, her community, which was linked to my own community. So I kept recognizing people's names, the bookstores she shopped in are the same bookstores I shop in. She has phone numbers of people that are friends of mine in the archive. She lived for someone who didn't drive, considered herself very shy, very held within. She referred to herself, I'm a hermit who lives in the middle of Los Angeles. She did have she moved out in the world, and she was involved with people, and she did things. So I'm going through papers, and one of the things I'm going through is correspondence, and I'm like looking, and I see letterhead that's familiar to me, and from an LA Weekly, and then I notice the signature that's familiar to me, and it's your signature, and you reached out to her to write a piece. And so to read, she kept all the correspondence, and what I was going to share, and I'll have to share with you later because I can't.
Letter.
No, I don't have the letter because I can't get into the archive right now because of COVID. But and I was going to go into it. But what I did find,
you showed me the letter once. Yeah,
I found
it was a contract.
No.
Oh, it wasn't a letter. Oh,
no. I found a note which she was making when she was talking on the phone with you.
Oh, wow.
So it's your name, it's phone number to the paper, it's the word rate, it's a little squib little thing about what the assignment is.
Right.
And in the middle of a whole lot of other stuff that was going on.
I paid her $1 a word. Actually.
No, you didn't actually.
I didn't? What did I pay her?
It was 29 cents.
No.
Yeah, I have it.
No, that can't be true.
Well, I'll show it to you.
No, that's interesting.
But that was pretty cheap. I was going to say, think about how long ago. But anyway, the reason I'm bringing it up, not to talk about the word rate, which is always bad for writers anyway, but is you reached out to her. It clearly mattered to her. Again, she drafted. I saw evidence of all that. But what made you tell them about this why you reached out to her, speaking of typewriters.
Right. I was doing a special issue on the future of reading and how the future of reading would evolve into e-type and electronic type, and the technology that was developing. This was long before the Kindle. And I called her to ask her about how she would see herself writing in the future. Would she be, would there be some way of writing longhand and turning that into type? And we had this conversation and she said, I'm not interested in any of that. I write on my same manual typewriter that I've written on forever. It's become, she's described how it was heavy and chained to the desk, I think.
Right.
I remember her telling me, and that she liked to write that way because she liked to go slowly and think about things as she wrote them instead of typing things. She was rejecting this notion that we had in society of doing everything at light speed.
Right.
And that's what that was about. Yeah.
That would make sense.
Yeah. And yeah, that's what she wrote about, her methodical process. And I loved that, so it stood in contrast to the rest of the issue, which was perfect.
Right.
Because when you're putting it together, something like that, you don't want everything proving your thesis.
Yeah.
You want to go back to, and yeah, I wish I could find that essay, because I think it's really important now when we're just, one thing about the COVID era is it has, for a lot of people, for better or for worse, a lot of times for worse, but it has slowed us down.
Yeah.
And we're spending less time in our cars, and we're, I remember at the beginning of the lockdown, we spent so much time talking to each other that we hadn't spent before, and I think this would have been an interesting time to have her insight,
Yeah.
and that there's a reason she's so important now. And
absolutely.
All the right reasons.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay, so it does look like we have a few questions in the queue right now. I want to get to those. Again, if anyone has a question, you can just type it up in the Q&A box, and we will see it listed here and get to it. The first two questions we have is actually from the amazing author, Lisa C. Her latest book was Island of Sea Women, by the way, which is a really phenomenal book. But Lisa's first question is, how did Octavia Butler originally come to Dale Carnegie and other prosperity and positivity thinking? Okay.
That's a good question. And it is a true story. And hi, Lisa. Another name I've encountered in the archive. She mentions, Octavia mentions you, and she does mention your mother as well, Carolyn, who was my teacher. So that was a beautiful resonance. She finds these books in a box on the floor in the Pasadena Public Library, the main branch. She doesn't know if they're getting ready to be thrown out or if they're just getting ready to be reshelved and moved, but she just something, the title, how to win friends and influence people, like these titles like called out to her. So she picked it up because she was someone who wanted friends. She was someone who needed support, and those books spoke to her. But she realized very early, even if she was like kind of paging through them, these aren't really for me. This is like, I am not the target audience, but I can work with this, which is really what was at the root of so much of what she did. The world wasn't fit for her. It didn't even make room for her, but she figured out how to twist things to make it work for her. So that's exactly what she did with those. And once she found one that worked, she found others, and then she went into the stacks and started collecting them. And that's exactly how it happened. It was, this total serendipity of finding these books on the floor in a library. And she made it, she came up with her own.
Amazing. And Lisa's second question is about the number of drafts that Butler wrote. Mm-hmm. Does the Huntington have all of them? Did you look at all of them? If so, can you tell us a bit about how those manuscripts changed over time? In particular, she requests if you have any information about Kindred as an example.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, to understand the archive really, and one of the images I wanted to show is how there's a finding aid that's hundreds of pages. And there's a binder that's like this thick. It's the biggest binder that's on the shelves in the reading room, and of what's in the archive. So in short, I did not look at all of the manuscripts because I couldn't, like when I decided I was going to do this book, Judith and I were talking about this earlier, I had to really make decisions. There's 3 different projects that I wanted to explore. And I did look at Kindred, and I did look at Parable of the Talents. And then I looked at some unpublished manuscripts, and things start all over. And just to finish this in a neat way. So I didn't go through every single draft of every single thing, because honestly, and this is what is so hard for people, like there's almost 400 boxes in the archive of her materials. So you could spend months, just looking at that. So, and they're like boxes of just, revisions. But what I did notice about her writing process is you see pieces of it everywhere. So she may journal about a book. She may journal about a character. She starts asking questions and answering questions about characters' interactions. And this may end up on the back of an envelope, in a tiny little notebook. In the middle of something else she's writing, she will start working on the novel. Then it gets all assembled somewhere, but she spends a lot of time pre-writing. So too, I noticed, and I noticed this more with the parables, again, because I didn't look as close. I'd love to go back. Can't wait till the library's open again, so I can start looking specifically at different books and the process. But what I noticed is that so much pre-writing about the character, developing the character, who she is, working out her feelings about the character, like Lauren, like she doesn't like Lauren, she does like Lauren. She's, it's this, she's working this stuff out, and she's working out her backstory. So with Kindred, Dana, the protagonist is based on her. She says, all these crappy jobs I gave to Dana, they were my jobs. I did all that work, so it was her way of also writing herself on the page too, and so you see some of that too, where she's writing what she knows, but then she's pushing it into other places. And again, same thing, it was one of her first, she took a trip to do research. It was one of the first research trips she could ever do. And so you see little bits and pieces everywhere, again, like a scatter. And so in a way, she kind of worked in the beginning, the pre-writing is sort of collage-like. And then it gets assembled, and she's writing longhand, and then she's typing. And then she resisted computers for a while because she would lose things, and she would lose her drafts. And then she would go crazy about, like, I can't believe I spent all this time working and I can't find it. She just didn't know where it had gone to. Like, so she had to go find a book that would explain that. But so then she started, and you'll see, we've all talked about this, is like, she would print out things 2 and 3 times. It might be the same exact draft because she was so afraid of losing it. So that's a little bit about how she would work.
And we have a question from a Julia Meltzer. She asks, I'm curious if you have learned anything new about the time you spent in the archive and Butler's writing process now that the book is out, and you've been doing these talks. What more reflection have you been allowed during this time?
That's a really good question. I think the thing that has become clearer to me in a way that's almost visceral, she put her body in front of her writing, so the time she spent protecting her vision and her voice it was exhausting. I mean, when I think about, like, you know, it's hard for writers anyway, but what she was trying to do was so ahead of its time, ahead of its curve. And when I went back to start looking at, you know, how much effort and energy and spirit it took to to do this, and that became really like, yeah, as I started to look back, especially at the journals and all of the sessioning journals, and these journals are different from, like, you know, this is what I did today. These were these journals where she'd come in, she might have had a rejection, you know, in a manuscript, or she might have had an altercation with someone, you know, trying to get paid, or someone she was working with, and she would have to work it out because she did not want that to get in the way of what she was trying to do, you know, in terms of the work. And I think about protecting her voice and vision as a Black woman writing from the West, where people are kind of like, you know, let's downplay the West, let's downplay this. Like, no, this is where I'm from. This is what I see. This is the ground I grew out. She protected that. And she has, in her determination, she engraved that in our bodies and minds, you know. So now when we walk around with those fire skies and the pink skies and people walking in the, that's her. And that's her looking really deeply at the place she's from and the place we might go if we don't watch it. And she protected that, and at great cost. So yeah, I'm like, I didn't think I could love her more, you know, in that sense, but I thought, wow, she just protected it, you know.
So we have one more question. This is from Christian Bruno, who, if it's the one I'm thinking of, is a regular customer of Chevalier's book. He has 400 boxes in the archives. I'd love to hear about how you structured your research. How did you even know where to begin?
Really great question. When I started in the archive, I was commissioned to do a piece for Clock Shop by Julia Meltzer. And she wanted me to she threw out this idea of doing a posthumous interview with Butler. I did not know what that was going to look like, feel like. But I was like, yeah, I would love to work in the archive. And then I got there, saw all these boxes, was overwhelmed in the beginning, thinking like, yeah, where do you start? And then as a reporter, you know, as a journalist, I'm thinking, I want the most personal voice. So I'm not going to look at the manuscripts. I'm not going to look at all of that because that's her doing something else. So I wanted to go to the most personal things. So I went to diaries, I went to journals, I went to letters. And then once I got to those pieces, I started to look at marginalia. And then I could really hear who she was, the unguarded Octavia, the unguarded Estelle, the girl. And that's when I began to hear her. And I've talked about this a lot because this is really key for journalists. I know Judith knows this, is like one of the things you hope for when you're, you know, doing a big piece about someone, profile, interview, you want access. And access means all kinds of things. It means time. It means them letting their guard down. It means, you know, you want them to get to the point where you may as well be a fly on the wall. They're not pretending to be something else around you. They're trying to be, that's all fallen off. And there's something about being in an archive and the sorts of diaries and the sorts of marginalia, the things that she was working on in her private moments that told me more about her. That kind of access you would never have. I could spend a year with someone and they would feel comfortable with me, but I would not get this. So it's so different than sitting like, you know, knee to knee to somebody across from them. I was over her shoulder. I was in her arm. I'm watching her on the page, you know, in her heart. And so I started to trust that relationship, that you know, and hear her, but it took time, back to being slow. Like I couldn't rush it. I had to kind of let her tell me where to go. And, you know, once I let go of like, okay, I know I have a deadline, but if you rush this, it won't work. She's telling you. So that's how.
Amazing. We're just about the end of the hour, but I had a whole list of questions I wanted to ask. So I'm going to choose one to ask you and close out our evening. So in the epilogue of this book, there's this one sentence that the moment I read it, it resonated with me as a bookseller, because you talk about how in college, when you worked as a bookseller, you would put Octavia's books facing out because she was, quote, one of us. And I do this all the time at the bookstore as well. So I'm just so curious about, how do I phrase this? About, you know, the power of her pioneering a space for Black women in sci-fi, about your journey going from a dedicated reader to, you know, being someone who has like archived her creative process. Can you just speak a little bit about you at that bookstore putting that book out to now putting this book out?
Thank you. Oh, that's, it's funny because when I was working in the bookstore, I was in college, and it was my part-time job, you know, and I was a full-time student, and yeah, there was no one. You know, we were talking the other day about like the people that I would go and see read. Wanda Coleman was someone I would go and see, who was writing about a very particular kind of Los Angeles that I wasn't seeing in other LA writers. And I'm a huge, you know, I just devour, you know, LA books, you know, all kinds, you know, noir and also, you know, poetry and just a wide range, you know, nonfiction and fiction. But Wanda was writing about a particular kind of place. And Octavia, seeing Octavia like at readings, you know, in bookstores, and being able to sit like inches away from her, and she's talking about her writing process, and she's talking about her moving around town, and she shows up with her purse and her this and her, and I'm like, flesh and blood. So that idea that like, you know, I think people forget how important it is to see someone who does look like you inhabiting that world. I mean, you can dream all you want to, and you can put yourself into all kinds of places, but there is something very powerful of seeing someone, a woman of color, someone like you know, sitting and doing these things. You know, you're not, so my writing and my path has been very, very different, but she cleared the way in certain respects. And I see it in the archive more. That was the thing, like where she showed up, where she did readings, what she asked for, you know, what she needed, what she would go home in session about after something ended. And she was like, I'm not going to let this thing happen to me again. You know, she would be upset about how she was photographed. Like people didn't know how to photograph her because of her skin color, you know, so she would have to tell them, like she would do some research. It's like, okay, this is how you have to set the lighting up. You know, I won't wear black. I'm not going to be black against a black background. I mean, all the things she had to think about. And I thought, oh, I'm writing this down, you know, like she did, you know, she trailblazed in lots of ways that I think people don't even think about.
Amazing. A million thank yous, first of all, to Linnell George and Judith Lewis. What a fantastic conversation tonight. Genuinely one of my favorite events I've had the chance to host so far for Shivali's book.
Thank you for having us.
I understand even more now why my coworkers are very insistent that I pick up one of Butler's books.
We'll have book group with you, you know?
Oh my God. Well, actually, we were supposed to have a staff book club with Parable of the Sower, but I skipped that one.
Oh.
I want to thank you for sharing your time. Thank you to our audience members, wherever you are right now, for joining us tonight. And before we say goodbye, I am going to drop the link one more time to buy a copy of Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky online for Chevalier's books. If you want to pick one up at Chevalier's Books, make sure to let us know at chevaliersbooks.com. And with that, Linnell or Judith, any last words for us before we say goodbye?
Judith, do you have any other questions for me?
I don't, but I just did want to highlight that one phrase about the tall girl writing all the time in the book, and that you know, that just seemed to describe you too, writing and taking photographs all the time. But thank you for inviting me, Linnell, and thanks for
doing this.
The bookstore for hosting. It was really fun.
Yes, it was fun, and it was just fun. Again, back to that community thing. I can't tell you how much that meant. It's like to see, you know, these names, and have Lisa pop up too, you know, like it's like, wow, like she's still like moving things around, you know, and she's moving people through time and space. She continues to do it. So we're all
kind of part of Octavia's carafe.
That's right. Yeah. It's true. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night. Good night.
Bye.